how are you? I didn't realise that we were going to come together so soon again after our experiences in a pub earlier this week. We were podcasting in a pub, whatever it was called.
That pubcast, no, it was great. I'm still reflecting on the food though. Cheese. Every known toasty variant was available, despite them saying most of it was I don't think Deacon's Delight was not available, but there was cheese and onion toasties and all kinds of toasties.
It reminded me of a joke that I was going to tell at the time, but I didn't get around to do it. I could do it now if you want.
Yes, please.
And it kind of fits in with the theme of the podcast today. And I've literally only just thought of it. Do you want me to do it?
Of course I do.
Yeah. So there are 3 rabbits, and they arrive at the gates of heaven. And St. Peter's there and kind of challenging them and stuff like that, and says to the first rabbit, so how did you come to be here? And the rabbit says, well, can't you see, look, I've got these big tyre marks right across my chest. He said, I was kind of trying to get across the road. Next thing I know, bang, car, lights out, gone. I'm stood here in front of you. Turns to the second rabbit and he says, so how did you get here? And the second rabbit says, well, there I was, gambling. I don't know if rabbits gamble, but let's say they do for the purposes of the joke. He said, I hear a bang, and all of a sudden, like, half my head's gone. He said, that's it. And I come round, and here I am in front of you. And he looks at the third rabbit, who, to all intents and purposes, looks entirely fit, well, and healthy. And he says, okay, rabbit number 3, how are you here? He said, there's a little pub just around the corner from where I kind of used to live. He said, and I used to go there every evening and kind of just clear the food that they threw away. He said, so Monday evening, cheese and onion toasties. Absolutely love a dream. He said, Tuesday evening, it was like a kind of tuna and relish toasty sandwich. Absolutely brilliant. Went down perfectly. Wednesday evening, ham and a pineapple toasted sandwich. Delicious. Thursday evening, he said, I think it was like a sausage and pickle toasted sandwich. He said, then bang, I wake up here. Apparently, you shouldn't be mixing the toasties.
Oh.
You can just imagine that the whole audience at home and on their treadmills over their listeners are in absolute hysterics.
I mean, we've just had to edit out 4 minutes of laughter from this session. And I mean, I can see exactly now how that ties in with the last podcast. But don't you think it's a bit unfortunate that we now have a speaker from the Rabbit Defence League? Did you think that through? Did you?
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the 2 IPs in a pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
Should we bring Doug in? Should we get him in?
Yeah, let's probably clarify he's not from the Rabbit Defence League.
Yeah, we should clarify that Doug is not from the Rabbit Defence League. He is from the British Society for... Now, is it for immunology or immunologists? There is a distinction between the two, obviously.
Yeah, for the British Society for Immunology.
So it's the practice of immunology.
That's correct.
So it would include immunologists and all sorts of other people who aren't necessarily kind of practitioners, but have an interest in and around the world of immunology.
Absolutely. And interesting, it's for human and animal health. So there's a rabbit theme in there somewhere, but it's a very small part of what we do.
When I was doing my little bit of research yesterday and a bit more further today, and I was kind of reading through the website, one of the bits I did see was veterinary immunology, which isn't something that's easy for me to pronounce, but I saw it there. And even that didn't remind me of that joke. It was just a few minutes ago when we were getting kind of into it. So, Doug, can you introduce yourself for listeners who are broadly patent attorneys, IP professionals, inventive people, creatives, and others?
I can indeed. So, yes, I am Doug Brown. I'm the Chief Exec of the British Society for Immunology. And we are a learned society, professional society that, Lee, as you say, represents anybody working within immunology, not just scientists at the lab bench, but also clinicians, also those that work in charities, in policy roles, in research funding roles, anybody who has that interest in immunology. And I've been the CEO for just shy of 4 years now.
Okay, so you've been there long enough to get your kind of feet under the table and feel comfy and know what it's all about and the like. And also I was thinking, we talked about this when you and I were doing a little bit sort of planning on this, but there are obviously a number of patent attorneys who operate in the life sciences and have a real interest in immunology. They may be your members, or if not, and they're listening to this, they might want to think about being a member.
I mean, absolutely. We'd welcome you if you are in the life sciences and in immunology. Thank you, Lee, for that plug.
I'll get a plug in.
Exactly. No, we currently have about 4,500 members, mostly in the UK, but about 10% overseas. And we have academia and industry, in the clinic, in policy. So yes, we would very much welcome you. In fact, when I took this job, I was many years ago a member of the British Society for Immunology. So I was a practicing scientist, did a PhD, did a postdoc in immunology research, and then worked in the medical research charity sector for 10 years after that. But then when this opportunity came up, it felt like my dream role, really, bringing together my passion for leading charities, but also my, I would say, history, not necessarily up-to-date expertise, to the extent that you see the professors these days within immunology, but really bringing my passion for immunology and what science and research can do to improve health. So dream job for me, really, where I am at the moment. I love it.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. I was going to say, it sounds like you've got the best job in the world, but you don't. I have. So
I'll arm wrestle you for that.
You should try being a patent attorney, guys. Sorry, you don't know what you're missing.
Oh, no, I know exactly what patent attorneys do, Gwilym. I know exactly what I'm missing, and I don't. So tell us a little bit about BSI then, what it's about, what its mission is, what it aims to achieve.
So yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, as we've said, we represent professionally anybody working in immunology. And so we are what's known as a learner society, and essentially support people working within the immunology sector to be able to do the very best at what they're doing in their role, so that we can have a positive impact on the lives of people and animals. So really looking to improve human and animal health. And we do that through supporting the networking, building that community. So putting on loads of events, big congresses, supporting the community to come together and share big ideas. We support careers. So all the way from postgrad, masters, through to end of career, actually. So those who are becoming emeritus professors and thinking about retiring, actually, how can they give back, particularly to the early career researchers, but continue to give to immunology? And then the third area we work in is really trying to create change. So be that catalyst for change, to create the environment for immunology to thrive. And as we say, ultimately, what happens in the lab, what happens in industry, that those discoveries come through as quickly as possible to have a positive impact on human and animal health.
And we're going to explore lots of that. And I was conscious that even during while you were talking there, Doug, I could have asked so many questions, and we're going to pick up on lots of that. But the one thing that I will say, and maybe I should reflect on now, is for a lot of people, immunology wasn't something they'd ever heard of 2 years ago. Now everybody is an internet expert on it, aren't they? The whole world has some kind of opinion on immunology. How does it feel to have been thrust into the spotlight like that?
Well, I mean, it feels amazing, actually. And as I say, I've always had a love for immunology and science, and bored my friends and family with it for many years. And I took this role on, say, just shy of 4 years ago. And I was very proud, my first chief exec role. We're going into this wonderful organisation, telling people, I'm going to go and work for the British Society for Immunology. And they were like, the British Society of what? And then what's hilarious is that through the pandemic, with the literacy, the science literacy, but also immunology literacy just out there in the general public, my friends are now phoning me up and telling me about different parts of the immune system and cell-mediated and antibodies and this how vaccines work. And it's like, seriously, you weren't interested 4 years ago, and now you think you're a professor of immunology. It's great. I mean, overall, it's absolutely wonderful, because it's brilliant to see people interested in these things, just for their interest. But actually, it's important, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, but in people understanding the medicines they might be having to take, or the vaccines that they're choosing to have, that if people understand them better, they have more questions, we can answer those questions, and they're much more comfortable in the decisions that they're making. So in a serious note, it's really helpful, but it's been hilarious seeing those around me that now are armchair immunologists, which can only be a good thing.
I heard a great quote recently that all the armchair immunologists had immediately pivoted to being experts on Central European defence strategy recently. So it's it does have. I have to say, I at the beginning of the pandemic, I've got a degree in physics, so I know that things are complicated and you have to study quite hard to understand them properly. I do know that, but I became very briefly an armchair expert on vaccines, and I was saying, I'm not going to roll on that in a few months. It takes longer than that. I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's so easy to get drawn in. And I think, yeah, as you say, I'm sure we're going to get onto the broader conversation there. But I learned quite a lot from the beginning of the pandemic about not being an armchair expert and really just biting your tongue when you don't know what you're talking about, which is a lot of the time. That's why I'm not saying much on this podcast.
I've never ever known you bite your tongue when you've not known what you were talking about. Yeah, so there was poor old Doug would attends a sort of membership, associations, social event. Some bloke overhears him talking about what he does and accosts him and says, "Oh, you need to come on a podcast." So I bet you'd never thought that the day would arrive when you'd be having a casual beer and everyone would want to talk to you about what you do in your day job.
No, it's it's usually been a bit of a push, not a pull. So I've been forcing myself. My team will tell you that I do like talking. I enjoy talking, but now finally some people properly listen to me. So no, it's lovely.
So we're going to talk a lot about, particularly about sort of vaccines and vaccine development, and we will touch on COVID and all of those kinds of things. But recognising that most of my members are like Gwilym, in that they work in intellectual property and are scientists, but won't necessarily have a kind of deep understanding of immunology. Do you want to sort of ground us in immunology, what it's about, and the kind of work that immunologists do on a sort of day-to-day basis?
Yeah.
When you're not obviously saving the world from some massive global catastrophe.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, actually, yeah, we're very proud of many of our members who have been really active during the pandemic, actually, and of course, a couple of our members were responsible for developing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and we rewarded them with honorary membership of the British Society for Immunology at the end of last year, and not just those working on vaccines, just trying to understand from the very early stages, well, what happens when this SARS-CoV-2 virus gets in our bodies. And why does it in certain circumstances turn into COVID-19, severe disease, and sadly in many cases we've seen death. So yeah, absolutely, and I can lift the lid on that and let you know what the membership have been doing around that. But generally, and say before pandemic, but during and now we're living with COVID. Immunology is a really exciting life science to be involved in. And, I would say this, wouldn't I? And I'm a little bit biased, but I mean, essentially the immune system is involved in pretty much every major disease that affects human and animal health, whether it's something that the immune system is causing the disease, or whether you can use the immune system to diagnose a disease, get a prognosis, or you target the immune system as a treatment, or you use the immune system as a treatment, or maybe even a cure or way of preventing, like we see in vaccines. Actually, rarely will you see a condition, a disease that doesn't have or couldn't have an immunological component. So a lot of immunologists, most of our members are those that are working in labs and working in clinics to understand disease, to treat the current diseases we've got as best they can, but also try and research new ways of trying to prevent, treat, cure, diagnose a number of different conditions, from cancer through to dementia, through to even trying to understand the impacts that the immune system has on mental health as well. So it really does stretch across all of those diseases that affect us on a day-to-day basis.
And I had heard the terms, and I now know what they are because I spent some time on your website. So I don't really need to ask you this question, but I'm going to because others might be interested. I had heard the terms being used about the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. What are they? What's the difference between them?
You don't have to ask the question, Lee. I mean, maybe you could answer no. I wouldn't make you do it.
No, you can't. You can't put me on the spot.
No, I wouldn't.
No. Actually, I want to go on, Lee.
Oh no, that's terrible far. So as I understood it, and even I don't even know if I understand that fully, but innate is something pre-existing in your body or your system that either stops or resists some kind of attack. So the mucousy stuff I've got up my nose kind of stops bugs getting in. Is that about right? I'm a lifelong sinus sufferer, so my system's never worked that well. And adaptive is the clever bit of your body that kind of engineers new stuff to fight things and get shot of it. Is that about right?
Lee, I'm handing my notice in tomorrow. You can become the chief exec of the British Society for Immunology. Yes, very, very good, actually. And so it essentially is that the innate is the part of the immune system that we're born with. And it's our first line of defense whenever a bug, a pathogen, either, as you say, gets in our mucosal surfaces or we cut our skin. The first bit of the immune system is that innate immune system that comes up and tries its best to get rid of that foreign body, that pathogen. And it does it in a pretty kind of scattergun approach. So it's not specific, but will throw everything it can at that pathogen to try and stop it in its tracks from infecting the body. But then there's the adaptive part of the immune system, which works in concert with the innate, but the adaptive is our second line of defense. You're exactly right. That is our learned immune system, immune response. So over the years, particularly in our younger years and our adolescent years, we see all these bugs, our body gets used to them. So when we see them again, we can get rid of them more quickly and more efficiently. So this is a very much a highly tuned part of our immune system, and it's very specific to the bug, the pathogen that they're seeing. So they're the kind of two main parts. And then what, again, during the pandemic, people have heard a lot about would have been with adaptive immune response. There's the antibodies that, say, are generated after a vaccination, but there's also the cell-mediated response. So there are kind of subparts of both the innate and adaptive. So it's a really complicated system to understand at that molecular level and what's going on, but they are broadly the main elements of the immune system that are important for us to understand about how these different treatments and infections happen, but also how vaccines work.
And why does, I mean, a question that's just struck me then, so on the adaptive side, if your body learns either itself because it's confronted with something or through vaccination to deal, I'm not using the proper language, I know a lot, but to deal with some stuff that's going on inside your body, why is it that some kind of vaccine responses, lifelong or certainly long term, and some, it's about kind of like the COVID related stuff, aren't they? You know, you kind of need boosters and all this sort of thing. Why are some forgotten or less well learned, whatever it might be?
Yeah, so there are a number of different things that go into this. And again, I'm not a professor of immunology, so I can't get into too much detail, but broadly, there are a couple of main things that will be happening here. So one will be the virus, the bacteria, the bug, the pathogen that the vaccine is against. How much does that change? And how regularly? So it can change its genetics, which can then change its protein profile. And so if your immune system has learned from a vaccine for one version of that virus and another version comes, like we've seen in COVID several times, then your body is ready to protect against that first one. But sometimes, not always, but if a second one comes along, it's less able to act on that one because the body has learned from the first version or the first variant. So there is that part of it, which is really key. But also it's actually, well, what part of the virus or the bacteria is the vaccine targeted to? And so that sometimes you get parts of the virus that actually, if you then get your body developing the antibodies and cell-mediated immunity, neutralizes and can really stop that pathogen in its tracks when it first comes in. But sometimes it might be targeting that pathogen in a way that actually it can escape it a little bit. So it reduces the risk of the infection or the severe disease, but it's found its way around. And again, with COVID, we're learning about the variants, but also all of the vaccines in use at the moment only target one part of the virus. So now we need to be looking at, well, actually, how can we create vaccines that target different parts or even multiple parts of the virus so that the vaccine not only can have a significant effect at reducing severe disease, but can also have a significant effect on the transmission of the virus. So there are always these improvements that we can make. But it's a good question.
Oh, thanks.
No, they're all good. They're all good.
I thought you were going to dive in with a good question. Then.
No,
Well,
I'm
you
going to
know.
dive in with a quick comment, actually. I'll tell you somebody who doesn't like vaccines is my 4-month-old daughter. She's rammed full of them at the moment. And there's nothing, the worst things in the world, this is low-key stuff. Taking her to a doctor with a big grin on her little baby face and sitting there, the look of horror and then pain as these things get stuck in her legs. But it's so lovely to the trust that she has. And I'm really, really pleased that these things are out there and that we've been looked after so well, even though I'm struggling to explain it to a 4-month-old at the moment.
Yeah, I remember it was a number of years ago that I went through that with my 2 children, and you don't feel like the best parent in the world. Well, you do and you don't, because you know that it's for their own good. They're going to grow up and they're going to be protected against these, preventable diseases, but sometimes really awful but deadly diseases just by a simple needle in their arm or in their leg. But at that moment in time, it's heart-wrenching for you as a parent, isn't it?
The look in their eyes is basically, what did you just do to my leg? What have you just done? What are you doing? Is basically the response.
And a sticker doesn't cut the mustard afterwards, does it?
But you're doing that from a educated perspective, aren't you, Gwilym? You understand. You're a physicist, not a chemist or immunologist, and so on. But you understand the science enough to know what vaccination is about. But I mean, I was reading fairly recently, there's been a big anti-vaccine movement, hasn't there, throughout the pandemic? And we might want to talk a wee bit about that if Doug's happy to. But that's spread, hasn't it? It's not just affected people's preparedness to be vaccinated in terms of the current pandemic. But I was reading that vaccination is tumbling generally because people seem to be becoming more sensitive to getting their children vaccinated, which to me seems just such a shocking thing. Why would we ever want things like measles and mumps and that to return? We wouldn't, would we?
No. It's been a topic that we've put a lot of effort and given a lot of attention to in the last 4 years, actually. And so pre-pandemic, of course, we didn't have COVID, but our main focus was on childhood vaccination, where over a number of years we've seen that rate drop. And at the same time, we've seen the rates of measles increase. In fact, a few years ago, the UK lost its measles-free status that was granted from the World Health Organization because measles cases were circulating in the community and they weren't isolated events. And so this is something we've been lobbying hard on, and the issues are the same as the issues that we've seen during COVID. Now, what we must accept is that the vast majority of people in the UK choose to get vaccinated, which is fantastic. Actually, we have really high rates of confidence in vaccination. There's an annual survey that the Health Security Agency does, picking up vaccine confidence in the country. And we have very high vaccine confidence compared to other countries around the world, particularly some in Europe and even some states in the US. And so that's something that we shouldn't take for granted, and we should celebrate and recognise that the general public trust their healthcare professionals. They can find trusted information about vaccines and they choose to get vaccinated. However, there seems to be a growing proportion, as you say, Lee, of the population that are a little bit more vaccine hesitant or vaccine inquisitive, that there are a proportion of society who are completely against vaccination. And as much as we provide information to them and will answer questions, that we may not be able to change their mind. But the proportion that is increasing is those that are vaccine hesitant and have questions. And what we're saying to that part of the population is, look, have questions, come to us, come to experts, go to your healthcare professional with those questions. It's okay to have questions. If you have questions, that doesn't mean to say you have anti-vaccine views. You are just interested. And as we touched on earlier, so many people became armchair immunologists or vaccinologists or virologists over the pandemic, which is great. That will generate more questions, and it's okay. Come to us with your questions. And we've got lots of information on our website, Vaccine Guide around COVID, but for childhood vaccinations as well, that really addresses the commonly asked questions that we know are out there. We want people to come to us we're also working in community-based programs as well. And we're working with London Borough of Bexley, with Newcastle City Council and Birmingham City Council to try and stimulate those vaccine conversations in the city. So bring immunologists close to the community thought leaders, the community leaders that are in various places of worship and various communities, to build their confidence in having conversations with their community around vaccination. Not to say you need to get vaccinated, but just to answer their questions and try and build that level of trust. So there's lots that we need to do. It's a small proportion, but it's a very important proportion of society that we need to engage with in a different way to answer their questions, understand their concerns, give them everything that they need, so that hopefully, they'll then make the right decision to go ahead and get vaccinated.
And having seen, taking a baby and had a jab stuck in the poor girl's leg. Beth, shout out Beth, well done, babes. I can see why people do get a little bit nervous about it, but it's fueled, isn't it, by quite insidious disinformation campaign out there as well. Do you ever spend time, do you have a plan to kind of look at where that's all coming from? Because the social media side in particular is the bit that one hears about. It's quite worrying that somebody out there, beyond people who don't know, that somebody's actually actively trying to confuse and befuddle. It seems a bit mean and horrible, to be honest.
It's really tricky, and the approach that we and others are taking is to really try and flood the public with accurate information, with evidence-based information, and it's very difficult to have a response to some of the views that are out there, or some of the myths that are out there. But what we are trying to encourage people is, just trying to signpost to trusted independent organisations like the British Society for Immunology, but also healthcare professionals in the NHS to get the right information. And if they see something they're concerned or worried about, then ask that question. Go to a trusted source of information within the healthcare system or within the charity sector, and those questions will be answered. So, as I say, even though that misinformation is circulating, there's still really high vaccine confidence in the UK, which is really encouraging. And so we want to try and maintain that, but as best we can, if anyone sees anything not sure about or worries them, visit our website or go and speak to your GP or your local practice nurse, and you'll get the information that you need.
Right.
Fantastic. Yeah, cheers for that, Doug. Shall we move on to COVID? Is it all right if we do a bit of focusing on COVID? Is that okay? I know it's kind of been talked to death, but so let me just set the context a wee bit. It's obviously been quite important for CEPA and its members, because it's also, as much as it's thrown a focus on the whole sort of science behind vaccines, it's also thrown a focus on intellectual property protection, and we'll come on to that maybe towards the tail end of the podcast. But if we just spend a little bit of time on the pandemic, how it came about and that sort of thing. So I think most of us by now know what COVID is, but even at the start of this, I learned something, because you used the MERS SARS proper name thing, which I can never remember, and talked about that as being kind of like the pathogen or whatever it is, and then the COVID-19 being the disease. And I've never really got it quite clear in my head, the distinction between the two and that kind of thing. So what is COVID, and why did it present such a big threat to the health of everyone, really?
Yeah, and they're good questions, and they're valid uncertainties as well, because actually everything moved very, very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic. As we know, if we can cast our minds back, over 2 years ago now, and what's really key is that we didn't actually coin the terms until partway into the pandemic. So it's all kind of come about as we went through and we learnt about the virus and the disease. So yes, SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. So it's a SARS coronavirus, and we had SARS-1 10, 15 years ago that emerged. This is SARS-CoV-2, and that was the virus, and that's the name that it was given. So what happens around COVID is, well, somebody gets infected by the virus, SARS-CoV-2, and then your body has a response to it. Not everybody, because you get asymptomatic infections of SARS-CoV-2, so not everybody responds in a disease way to the virus. But if somebody does generate an illness and a disease, That's known as COVID-19. And so the virus is SARS-CoV-2. The disease itself and the effects of the infection is COVID-19. And what we've seen is, thankfully, a lot of people who are infected with SARS-CoV-2 have a mild to moderate COVID-19. Now, I've had it once. I know people have had it a couple of times, including my 10-year-old boy. And actually, when you say it's mild to moderate, it doesn't feel like it at the time. It's been, a really bad flu and makes you feel really ill. But on the scale of things, most people, either through previous infection now and or vaccination, are pretty well protected from that disease side of things. But in some cases, particularly those who are more vulnerable, and we've read about those in the news, age is a big factor, but obesity, underlying health conditions as well, those people are more prone to severe disease and unfortunately death as well. And the severe disease in COVID-19 is actually where your immune system is in overdrive. And it's trying to fight the infection. The viral loads are high, and there's lots of immunology chemicals running around your body. And actually, your immune system starts attacking your lungs, and it can, in those severe cases, start attacking other parts of your body, leads to severe disease and sometimes death in those cases. So, ironically, to try and prevent severe disease, and it can do that in 95%. It is severe. Is your immune system in overdrive, overactive, which is largely causing the damage and the problems that we see in COVID-19?
So we were told at the outset by certain elements that the answer to this was herd immunity. Again, another phrase that I didn't know before 2+ years ago, but now I know it and understand it. And but it wasn't the best idea, was it? Didn't seem like it was going to work. Looked like we were going to lose a lot more people than we might need to lose to reach that level. Did the BSI have a position on herd immunity? And if it did, how did it sort of influence government if it needed to?
Yeah, so herd immunity is a good goal to be aiming for a lot of pathogens, actually. And we see that, and we talked about the childhood vaccinations. Through the vaccination program, we need 95% coverage of the MMR vaccine within the population for us to hit what's known as herd immunity, which means we can pretty much eradicate or at least stop community transmission of the bug. And so herd immunity is not a bad goal, but for something that is unknown, where there are no vaccines for it, and it can cause severe disease and have an effect on death rate, we didn't know at the beginning of the pandemic how best to deal with it. Government's official policy wasn't herd immunity. We can see why the term was used, but we would agree that the herd immunity strategy, which the government said it didn't have, was the right approach, because there were too many unknowns at that point. And if we were to allow SARS-CoV-2 to make its way through population without the restrictions in place, all of the modelling showed even more subsequently after that actually we would have ended up with a much higher rate of death from the virus. And so actually early on in the pandemic, I feel this was a real success story for the role that learning societies, professional societies can play actually in amplifying the voice of their members. We very boldly, I would say, and very directly wrote an open letter to Number 10, to the Chief Medical Officer, the scientific advisor, and just making it very clear that we had concerns within the immunology community that if we weren't going to try and reduce the level of transmission, there could be real problems for the general public, and that if we were relying on a herd immunity approach, then that could lead to excess beyond what could have been managed. And so I would say it was a real success story, because then that did open doors, and it was great. It was well received by government. Actually, we ended up writing a few more letters to them, but having meetings with the different advisors and different committees. We established our own tasks on policy issues and put there a load of reports, updating what we knew, we didn't know about immunology, and sending out to government advisors. And And we can see, and we were told that actually all of this advice has been really helpful, taken on board when the policymaker are developing their policies. So I think it was wonderful that we're able to have that opportunity and work with our members and bring that expertise through to the policymakers. But I think in whatever issue, I think it's a great example of what us as professional societies can do, working with our members to have impact on legislation and on government policy.
I think you make a really great point there. I mean, we're doing some work at the moment on a particular issue that is game changing for the intellectual property profession in the UK. We can't be as public about it as you were there. We can't write open letters and things like that because it's just too sensitive and it needs to be managed in a particular way. So often your members don't see the good things that you do. When you do achieve something like this, it's really important, isn't it, that you tell your members, that you shout about it. You're absolutely right. It's a real example of the power of professionals working together through their association.
It was when that Imperial, I think it was Imperial College did some modelling, didn't they, about what might happen. I think that was one of the big tools that was used at the outset. I think that's when I started shutting up and remembered that there were real experts out there doing some amazing stuff. And that modelling was incredible, actually. It was and chilling. This is how it could go because of all the uncertainty around it. It always occurred to me that one of the problems was it wasn't just a health issue; it was an economic issue. It was the impact of lockdown basically on the economy, and it was a social issue, which is, are people going to do lockdown? So it seemed so multidimensional that if you took an incredibly rigorous healthcare approach, then everyone says, yeah, but the economy collapses, and you take a too looser one, etc., etc. Did you find yourself collaborating with other areas of expertise as well? Because that was one of the issues, wasn't it? It was more than just one factor.
Yeah, no, absolutely was. And for all of the good things that we can do as a professional society, a learning society, we do, as you say, have to be very careful about where we're expert and where we're not. And particularly in those multifaceted issues where actually, yes, immunology is important, but we also recognise that we're giving you our advice, but you as policymakers make that decision. And so we just wanted to make sure that the expertise of the immunologist was in the mix, because early on in, even pre-pandemic, in the couple of months when we knew this virus was coming out of China, didn't know where it would go and the scale it would be, we could see that there's sort of virologists, which is important, epidemiologists and social behavioural scientists and modelers, which was great, but there was a voice missing. And so what is wonderful, the government recognised that, and then we were getting immunologists around the table. So we had immunology representation at SAGE and in the committees as well. And in fact, we ended up, so speaking to colleagues across Europe, we ended up being quite the envy of European colleagues.
Doug, it's great to, yes, so many different people contributed to a totally unprecedented situation, I think, since the 20s or whatever it was, but basically totally unprecedented. Do you think we learned a lot? Do you think we're ready for the next one? Because they do say there's another one coming, don't they?
So it's inevitable, bugs that make the jump from animals into humans, but also those that are already existing, where there will be genetic modifications and viruses, bacteria may become more infectious or more deadly. So it's a given, and that is human nature. What was unprecedented was the scale of COVID-19. So whether we're not scaremongering, whether we get a COVID-19 again in however many years' time, we absolutely don't know, but we know there will be, and we're seeing it at the moment with monkeypox that's happening. Something different has happened to that virus, or at least the behaviour of people around that virus that means we have to try and understand that and be prepared for it. So actually, yes, we took a lot of learnings, and for something on the scale that we saw with the pandemic, it was wonderful how the community, and again, multi-sectors coming together, that essentially shortened what was a 10-year time frame previously of discovered making a vaccine available into 10 months. It really was. And it was because we had unprecedented coming together of those different sectors of university research, of industry, government funding, regulators, but also the public who were putting themselves forward for the trials, and in vaccine production as well. Usually these things are done stage by stage, you learn from it, and then you go on to the next stage because you're reducing the financial risk. Largely, it's that financial risk that there's no point putting millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions in something if you don't think it's going to work. This time it was worth it because it was such a big issue. So the money was thrown at it. So the only risk that was taken was financial. We never took any risks from patient safety or participant safety or public safety when we went through, because we went through the same journey, through the same steps, but just did it much more efficiently. One of the analogies that we use, in fact, is like getting across London. So if we were in the East End of London, wanting to get to, I don't know, have a coffee with someone in the West End of London, and we're in a car, that will take us ages, donkeys. We've got to get through the route, the lights, the traffic, all of that. It takes a long time. Now, if we were the Queen and we're in East London and we wanted that coffee in West London, we'd be there in no time because traffic lights will be green, the traffic will be stopped, and it will be the way will be made for the Queen through. So the same journey is travelled, but in the past, it was blogs in that journey east to West London, but for the pandemic, it was the Queen going from east to West London. So able to do it much more quickly without cutting corners because everything was in place to make it happen. So it was great. What a wonderful effort. And, William, as you say, lots of learnings that we can take into pandemic preparedness for future pandemics and into developing vaccines for pathogens that we already know about. But also for disease areas like cancer immunotherapies, we could develop more of those and much more quickly if we were able to take on some of the learnings from the pandemic. So we're currently in discussion with the government at the moment, trying to think, well, what are those good things, things that really work from a research perspective in immunology and in vaccinology that we can embed in the infrastructure in the UK and keep going for future pandemics, for COVID, but also for other disease areas. So yeah, plenty of learnings, and I think a really exciting
and also
time
hopefully
ahead.
Huge increase in public confidence in the process. I think one of the things that, as I say, at the very beginning, and from my armchair, I was thinking, they can't develop vaccines that quickly. But of course, we've seen it happen. They were safe. It's all worked brilliantly, as you guys always knew. One of the debates that we've heard a lot from our little world is, the role of IP in all of this. Obviously, IP does stimulate innovation. It gives you that exclusivity that you need to kind of get the recompense, yada yada. And everybody involved in it has talked about how IP wasn't just suddenly turned into something that facilitated collaboration, that people could work together. But somewhere along the line, there has been quite a strong school of thought that IP slowed things down, in particular to the way that vaccines got to or were developed, in less developed countries. We've had plenty of podcasts talking through that, and obviously we love IP and we know how important it is. Interested in guys, your position is on all of that, because frankly, we are moving towards what looks like some kind of limited IP vaccine waiver going forwards, which frankly, as specialists, we've talked about this, seem to be the core of the problem.
Yeah, and the caveat here is that I'm not an IP patent law expert.
That's right. Neither does Gwilym.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's
good.
But I did have. It was a long time ago. A couple of. My PhD. It didn't come to anything, but it was important to protect it at the time. But no, I'm not an expert in patent law. But your point is absolutely right. Actually, it's not. Where our position is not necessarily trying to be expert on the different parts that might be at play, but actually what we want to see, number one, is that the life sciences sector is set up in a way that does support innovation and stimulate innovation and investment in life sciences. And from our non-expert position, it seems like patents, intellectual property are a really important way of doing that. So we wouldn't want anything to happen that stifles that innovation, in particular immunology. I keep back to it, but the pipelines are full of immunological agents that are coming through in clinical trial that are likely to be really powerful against lots of different diseases. And the UK gets the most impact out of its immunology research in all of the G7 nations. That was some research we did a couple of years ago. So we want to keep that global status, and there's clearly something happening and going right in the UK around this. So we wouldn't want anything to try and harm that. The flip side is at the same time, when we're developing medicines, we're developing vaccines, we would absolutely, our position is we want them to be available to people across the world, to everybody who can benefit. And whatever the vehicle is to make that the case is something that, you know, we would be supportive of. So the Wellcome Trust, as you're probably aware, has quite a lot of policies around affordability of medicines in the research that they are funding, particularly in their collaborations with industry. And that's really fantastic, because at the early stages, there are conversations around, well, actually, if this treatment or vaccine is approved for use, it gets that marketing authorization, how are we going to make it available to all the different countries and populations across the world who can benefit? So where we want to be with these vaccines, and in fact it's really important, we've seen it with the different variants that are coming through, that in largely unvaccinated populations that increases the likelihood of new variant generation, is actually with the COVID vaccines and others, but we're talking about COVID, is that they shouldn't just be available to high-income countries, but low and middle-income countries as well. But how big that patent part of it is at stopping that from happening, I couldn't comment on. But there are other issues as well, like the cold storage, the cold supply chain, storage chain for getting these vaccines out to different low and middle-income countries. Also, their public health infrastructure and getting the vaccines, once they're in the country, out into the arms of people in the community. So from a non-expert perspective, I can see that there are lots of pieces to this puzzle that need solving, and there isn't one silver bullet that can solve it. Actually, there's a lot of effort that needs going through WHO, UN, other global infrastructure, Gavi, which is a huge immunisation organisation working globally, primarily in low middle income countries. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in those countries to be able to have their populations benefiting from these wonderful medicines.
Please do lean on CEPA as and when you want to kind of, should this come up, because I mean, we've got a couple, 2,000 or 3,000 people who are quite good at this kind of thing. I think one of the observations that we made and that we kind of put out a little bit is that it's not the first time there's been a global crisis of some form. And what you see happening is that the IP system remains robust and important, but it maybe changes its emphasis a tiny bit from a purely economic kind of its stimulator of innovation to one of its other roles that people forget about a little bit, which is a facilitator of collaboration. Organizations basically can use IP to make sure that they can work together whilst making sure that their kind of stake remains strong. And this isn't the first time we've seen that. And we saw, as you know very well, hundreds of beautiful initiatives between businesses where they just work together, and the IP was behind all that just to make sure that when things settle down, everyone knew what they put in and knew where they stood. So really keen where we can to feed into that debate and to say IP was never the culprit. It can be used brilliantly at times like this, and it was. And maybe for the next time around, that's what people should focus on, is just making sure that people recognize the power of patents and so on, to give people a nice stake in what they're doing and to make sure that when it all comes down, everyone knows how everyone contributed. So just a little kind of hope that a little plug there for the IP side of things, and hopefully more collaboration between our organizations on that front at some point.
Sounds fantastic. Definitely. There we go. We're building collaborations on a podcast. I like that.
And that seems, we've sort of reached a natural conclusion there with the collaboration. To my mind, it seems to be the place to be. There was a lot in what you were saying that made me think that we probably ought to reach out to you as well, Doug, and your people when we're thinking. Very often when we're doing policy development, we get very inwards looking, and it's about what does this mean for IP. We don't often look outwards enough. So if you don't mind, perhaps we'll tap you up in the future when we're doing our own policy development, if it links across to immunology.
My actual and Zoom door is always open.
So you're sat there, we're at the end of the podcast. Are you thinking, I'm glad they didn't ask me that one? Is there a question in your mind that you think, I'm glad they didn't ask me that one?
No, there isn't actually. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm really gutted that you didn't schedule me in for the pub podcast.
We did talk about that.
Sorry,
so,
I know.
We want to wait for another pandemic till that happens. So, but no other questions. You've covered the ground really well, and it's been.
There is one quick point, Lee, if I can, which actually we've exploded a few conspiracy theories, I think, during this.
Go on, mate.
But Doug, you've pushed on another one that I'm quite concerned about, that we all know is out there. It is true then that when the Queen drives through London, they can control the traffic lights. Is this true?
I kind of just made that up as part
You
of the
can't
analysis.
see. This is how it starts. This is how it starts, Doug. You've got to be careful.
Maybe there's got lots of people pressing the pedestrian lights
So
on the other road. You see, that's what it is.
Gwilym knows that I always finish the podcast with a random question that has nothing to do with anything we've been talking about. And this was going to be my random question, but it was going to be something that we were talking about. It was the Queen thing. So this final question on the podcast. So it's to you first, Doug, and then Gwilym gets a crack at it. If you were Queen for the day, what would you change to make your life easier?
Oh, don't know. Shorter school holidays. So childcare is not
Shorter
a
school
problem.
holidays?
How about that?
Let's hope your children aren't listening.
Free crisps.
Go on then, Gwilym, what's yours?
Free crisps.
So what? I
Yeah.
missed that. What?
Just walk into a shop
Free
and say, "Like some
crisps?
crisps," and say, "Of course, Your Majesty."
Should have gone with the crisps.
Lee, I've got to ask you now. Lee, he comes up with the questions, Doug, and he's always got
You do have
his
to ask
answers.
me.
And he
Yeah,
drops
that
you
is-
in it, and he's like been thinking about it for 3 days. Go on, Lee.
Not 3 days. It's been about 10 minutes for this one. I absolutely detest self-service checkouts. When I go to shop, I like the courtesy of there being someone to attend to me, to take my money, to make sure I'm happy with the experience. So I would get rid of those horrible kind of like beep your own things and take shopping back to a real personal experience.
You're right. Actually, I'd revise take us back to the 90s. That's what I would do. If I was Queen for a day, I'd take us back to the 90s. Music, food, no tablets, amazing.
Doug, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. What we'll do is we will engineer another day in a pub when we bring in perhaps some of our life sciences crew, and you can just come in and kind of add a little bit of external experience into our life sciences podcast in the future, if that's okay. So I will give you a shout.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. And Gwilym, I'll see you on the next one, mate, whenever that might be.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.